Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, in a world ravaged by a zombie outbreak, the only hope for the future is the girl with all the gifts. Melanie, played by Senya Nanua, is an extraordinary girl that's very intelligent and intuitive, listening intently to her teacher Helen Justno, played by Gemma Arterton. However, she's also a second-generation Hungry, kept underground and restrained in a military base after much of the world has fallen to a fungal outbreak. She and her fellow Hungries are being studied by Dr. Caldwell, played by Glenn Close, who is looking for a cure, but when the base is overrun, Melanie saves Helen and escapes with Caldwell and Sergeant Parks, played by Paddy Considine. As they make their journey across London, Melanie holds the fate of the world in her hands. The zombie subgenre, if you excuse the phrase, has almost been done to death by this point. They had a major resurgence over a decade ago, and ever since then we've had countless iterations on it, including found footage, to comedy, to even romance in some examples. And it's just become majorly oversaturated, and if you see a zombie movie now, half the time it's normally a comic take on it. And it really says something that the most prominent example of the subgenre in recent years is World War Z, a PG-13 take on it that is literally bloodless and toothless. And that is a shame because zombies are an inherently creepy idea. They're basically walking, shuffling reminders of death and our own obsolescence. And you can make very thoughtful use of that particular idea if you wanted to. And in the case of The Girl with All the Gifts, it's more of a return to that particular side of the genre. The Girl with All the Gifts is based on a 2014 book written by Mike Carey, who also wrote the screenplay for this film adaptation. He actually wrote the film adaptation and the books simultaneously. So there is quite a uniform feel in terms of the tone and the characters. However, in terms of the plotting between the two distinct versions of this tale, there are some major changes in the film version from the book. I'll get to those in a minute, but I think it's very important to say that while this is very faithful in terms of its mood and atmosphere, it's not strictly faithful in terms of story if you're a fan of the book. The idea behind The Girl with the Gifts is not a particularly new one. I mean, it can be traced all the way back to Day of the Dead, for example. This idea of sympathy for the monster, giving the zombies more humanised traits and personalities. But it tries to do something unique and different within that particular concept, and you can tell that right from the outset with the way that this particular zombie outbreak has been visualised on screen. That the infection has started from a fungal outbreak. This isn't the usual sort of zombie virus or poisoned meat or any of the usual tropes. You don't normally see fungal sort of infections, and it's this idea that it's gone from insects and made its way to man, and it's basically taken over people's bodies, and you can see that in the design of the Hungries as they're known in this movie, and you can see that in the faces, and they're all covered in fungal growths, and almost like the mould is slowly eating and breaking its way through their bodies. And in terms of the Hungries in this movie, there are two distinct types. There's your first generation infected, which are your more traditional kind of zombies. And in this case, they have a major debt also to 28 days later. And in fact, the film in general owes a big debt to Danny Boyle, for example. Not just in the fact that it's treated less like traditional movie zombies and more like the infected, and when they get their urge for blood, for example, it's very much akin to the rage virus victims in those particular movies, for example. You also have the second generation, which is what Melanie's a part of, and these are essentially the offspring. And what these are basically children, and they have much more human personalities, and they have a little bit more control and restraint to a certain extent of that infected side of their personalities. But at the same time, they're still monsters. They're still potentially deadly to the humans in their particular vicinity. And there's something quite creepy and unsettling about them. The idea that it is that the infection is still very much hardwired into them. There's this quite beautiful metaphor that very much reverberates across the entire film about how their brains are almost covered in sort of an infection like moss. And this idea of it being somewhat nature reclaiming humanity is seen all the way through The Girl with All the Gifts, especially in terms of the production design, especially when we go to London and the city, because this is set almost well after a decade after the initial infection, and the filmmakers, in a very astute move, they actually base the city on Pripyat, the former site of Chernobyl, and so you have this idea of it being this urban metropolis, but the buildings are all decaying, and you've got this overgrowth surrounding and building up through the cities, and they've essentially become jungles, but you can still recognise them as essentially former cities, and it's quite haunting. It very much reminds you of the fragility of our existence, and how one kind of outbreak and everything could potentially topple over. As far as the film itself, by far its best section is the opening act, which is superbly directed by Cole McCarthy, making his second feature after working extensively in TV, especially on Peaky Blinders, working from Carey's script, and the two of them do a really good job of realising much of the movie from Melanie's perspective, and that's a major boon in the early stages, because we are essentially learning alongside her. It just gradually introduces you into the world step by step. So we first meet Melanie in her cell as she gets into a specially modified wheelchair that has additional restraints on her legs, arms and head, and immediately you wonder, okay, she's both very intelligent and astute, but she must be quite dangerous because of how everything has to be restrained. And she's obviously in some kind of military base because there are soldiers that are strapping her into this chair, but we don't know where we are because this is all underground. And she and her fellow Hungries are all being led into this classroom. And of course, we don't know exactly what they are at first, or how they behave. All we see are children, easily empathetic children. And that's much how Gemma Arterton's character, who teaches all the children, sees them. She sees them as pupils. She doesn't see them as threats. It very much puts us on the same page as Melanie, in that she's got this very childlike curiosity and inquisitiveness about her world, and so do we. And as that world expands across the running time, we get more and more of an idea of just how bleak the situation is for humanity as we know it. But at the same time, there is this grim kind of hope blossoming under the surface, and this was very much something that was part of the book that is translated quite well on film. If you want to read it that way, there is very much this unusual idea of one generation being afraid of the next one. Normally this idea of children is hope for the future, that they will correct the mistakes of the previous generation, and yet we have an entire group of adult characters who are deathly afraid of this next generation, this classroom full of child monsters, essentially. And the movie never lets you forget that about Melanie. It constantly reminds you, especially in the later portions of the movie, where Melanie goes around wearing this mask that is almost reminiscent of a Hannibal Lecter mask to try and restrain her. But also, much of the second half of the film, we see Melanie and her face and her shirt is just caked in blood. But you have these three adult lead characters played by Gemma Arterton, Paddy Considine and Glenn Close. And of course Arterton sees Melanie as a child who could potentially bring hope for the future. And each of these characters all see Melanie in different ways. They all see it through different prisms. You compare that to Sergeant Parks, played by Paddy Considine, and it's not that he's inhuman or anything like that, but he always sees these child Hungries as potential threats, as potential weapons, and that is completely understandable because he's had to defend against their particular attacks and trying to make sure that the infection doesn't spread within the base. And then you have Glenn Close as Caldwell, and it's quite interesting to see Glenn Close in a horror film. If you've ever wanted to see Glenn Close fighting zombies, this is the movie for you. But Close does a good job of representing this scientist who has started out, she's trying to find a cure, and she perhaps started out with very noble intentions, but has gradually become corrupted. She's lost her own humanity at the expense of it. She doesn't see Melanie as a person in her own right. She sees her as a science experiment. She's very fascinated at the mere concept that Melanie has emotions and intuitions, for example, like a normal person would, but that somehow surprises her because she just sees them as something that she can work on for her own benefit. She has a noble aim, but she's become cold and completely lost. Close is probably the standout performer in this movie. She doesn't have the hugest part, but she really enjoys her role. However, after the story leaves the base, after the Hungries overthrow it in a truly visceral and exciting sequence that again very much recalls sequences in 28 Days Later, my problems with the movie begin with the fact that I feel like the movie loses direction at that point. It feels like the movie has a lot of energy that just fizzles out the more it progresses in the second half, unfortunately, which is a shame because the movie spends so much time building up this very tense and sort of surreal atmosphere, which is aided by the score. The score to this movie is really unsettling and creepy, but also melancholic in a certain sense. And it really adds that certain unusual atmosphere of a world kind of out of balance. To a certain extent, the movie feels like it's uneventful and repetitive, especially in its second act. There are not one, but two sequences where Melanie is let on her own to explore because she has an added advantage in that the Hungries won't attack their own, so that she's safe to explore areas that they can't, for example. But there's two sequences like that are both placed one after the other in the narrative, and it feels like we're going over the same ground. And the characters that are so well realised at first, they start acting in ways that feel completely unnatural, and it feels like they're, in many cases, falling to the usual horror film problem of doing very stupid decisions purely for the sake of the plot or for a scare. And you can see this in the case of the young soldier that accompanies the group to London. He gets to wander off on his own, and he wanders into this very obvious situation to the audience and just gullibly follows it. And it's almost completely ridiculous, this moment. You just think to yourself, how is a trained soldier falling for this? It's completely absurd. It really is. It makes him look less like a soldier and more like a blundering idiot. And this affects Glenn Close's character as well, because it feels like Carey has taken the fact that the character was cold and taken the next step into callous. It feels like the movie is trying to reconfigure that character into being almost an antagonist, a villain figure, and it doesn't feel right. It feels really kind of forced. In some senses, the characters don't really grow or change, and you can really see that with Gemma Arterton. Gemma Arterton, she doesn't really get a character, she gets an ideal of this wonderful, selfless, thoughtful teacher. But once they're on the road together, there's not much her character actually contributes to the story. She's just around, unfortunately. In terms of Melanie herself, Senua Nanua does a superb job as Melanie. There's something really quite threatening about how smart she is, to a certain extent. The fact that, for example, she's already memorised how the procedure goes that harnesses her to the wheelchair better than the people that are doing it themselves. And that by itself is creepy, even before we realise just how much bloodlust is coursing inside of her, and just how dangerous she can be. And as the film progresses, it becomes clear that she is definitely the smartest person in the group by far. And while occasionally that does irritate, there is simply because there is that certain know-it-all quality about her. I think the performance is very strong, and you can see as the film progresses, it feels like Nanua gets braver with the movie. It feels like as the character grows in confidence, so does she, and she really comes to her own in the final stages of the film, in stark contrast to the film around her. And she does a superb job of working off these very, very established actors, very competent actors like Glenn Close and Paddy Considine, who is reliable as ever in this movie and adds a certain amount of humanity to a part that could have come across as being quite gruff. They all work off of each other really well. By far my biggest problem, though, is the ending, and people who have read the book will know exactly why I'm having to tiptoe around this, because it's a very difficult and complicated ending to unpack without giving it away. But fans of the book, they were adamant they did not want the crucial event in this ending changed, and true to his word, Carey has kept that in the film version. But that doesn't mean he hasn't changed substantial portions of the third act, and in the case of an ending like this, context is everything. So the book and the film, they both share certain developments in common with each other, but the order and reasons of why those happen have been greatly shifted in the film version. It feels like it's missing a few steps to earning the right to this kind of ending in the same way that the book did. And it's going to leave many people who haven't read the book, in some cases, just infuriated and disappointed. And in some level I was disappointed, because if they kept it faithful to the book, it would have been better than this third act that is really a bit of a mess, unfortunately. And that's a real come down, because when this movie started, I genuinely thought this had a chance of being one of the best films of the year. And in its best moments, it could have transcended the zombie subgenre. As it stands, it's easily one of the best zombie films to come out in recent years, but it's such a shame that it could have been so much more than that. The Girl with All the Gifts is an intelligent and thoughtful zombie film that is easily one of the best in years, for its first half at least. Playing somewhere between 28 Days Later and Day of the Dead, the film's earliest scenes cast a surreal and unsettling trance as we're gradually introduced to its world alongside Melanie. Once the group reaches London, however, it ends up losing direction and energy before its disappointing third act, and the ending is severely diluted by the changes made for the adaptation. There's strong performances from Close and Considine, although Arterton is unfortunately saddled with playing an ideal, while Nanua grows into the title role more as the film progresses. While it doesn't live up to the promise of its early stages, it's still recommended to horror fans who like a bit of gristle to chew on. Coming up soon, I'll finally get to breaking the bank and decide whether I'm a swore on Amazon, and Alexander Skarsgård and Michael Pena are two corrupt cops declaring war on everyone. But until then, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.
You can save everybody. Oh my god.